Sincere concern. To communicate effectively to those who are living out of the will of God, we must be able to demonstrate sincere concern regarding their sinful behavior. Here now is Gene Getz.
The prophet Micah definitely exemplifies this principle as he is expressing his concerns for the people of Israel, both kingdoms, north and south, who are walking out of the will of God. And so let's go immediately to what he says right from the beginning of this prophecy. In Micah chapter 1, verse 1, the word of the Lord that came to Micah the Morshite. There were a lot of individuals in the Old Testament that were called Micah. And so consequently, frequently where a name is common, they're identified with where they live. And that's exactly what we have here when he's called Micah the Morshite. What this basically means is that he lived in this particular area of the world. Let me just show that to you graphically. Here you see Jerusalem, and there you see Moresheth Gath. That was his hometown. And you also see some other prophets. Isaiah was a contemporary with Amos. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem, but Micah lived in Moresheth Gath. Now let me simply say that the other two prophets, Hosea and Amos, were contemporaries as well, relatively speaking, but they spoke primarily to the northern tribes, whereas Micah spoke to Judah. Although he spoke to both, he spoke primarily to Judah. And the word Gath really is added to that town because just a short ways away was a city called, or a town called Gath. And that, by the way, has some very interesting connotations because about 400 years before Micah prophesied, something very significant happened. There was a giant named Goliath who lived in Gath. And you can be sure that Micah knew that story well, even though that story of David and Goliath had happened nearly 4 centuries before Micah penned these words. So we read, the word of the Lord that came to Micah the Morshite. That's his hometown, basically. What he saw regarding Samaria and Jerusalem. Now, basically what that means is when he says Samaria was the capital of the northern tribes. So he's including all of the northern tribes because this is the capital, and it represents all of the northern tribes. When he says Jerusalem, that's the capital of Judah, and that represents, of course, all of Judah. So immediately you see the recipients of these prophecies. So we read, the word of the Lord that came to Micah the Morshite, what he saw regarding Samaria and Jerusalem in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Now we're going to focus on those kings just a little bit later. But they're all kings of Judah, which means he was speaking to all of Israel, but especially he had a focus and a message for Judah, because that's where he lived. He was a prophet from the land of Judah. And so he has a statement relative to some very severe judgment that is going to come. And most of these prophets were challenged by the Lord himself to reveal these messages of judgment because of their sins. And so we read about that, this severe judgment, going on into verse 2. Listen, all you peoples. Pay attention, earth, everyone in it. The Lord God will be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. Look, the Lord is leaving his place, coming down to trample the heights of the earth. The mountains will melt beneath him. The valleys will split apart like wax near a fire, like water cascading down a mountainside. Now that's a very dramatic presentation. And obviously, it has application to what's going to happen when the Assyrians come in and take power and control of the northern tribes. It also refers to the Babylonians. But it almost sounds like John, doesn't it, writing the book of Revelation. In terms of what is going to happen in his time, when the Assyrians and the Assyrians come in and the Babylonians come in, this has to be obviously metaphorical. It's hyperbole because it describes something that never happened. But when you compare it on into the future, a long view, there could be certainly an application of what is going to happen when Christ finally judges. And the language is very similar to some of the things we read in the book of Revelation. But the near view is in view here as far as Micah is concerned. And you see that in the fact that he is agonizing over this situation. I've called this Micah's agonizing lament. Because of this, that is, because of all this judgment that's going to come on Israel, both north and south. Because of this, I will lament and wail. And his language is very descriptive and probably literal, because this is how they expressed incredible, agonizing lament over what is going to happen. I will walk barefoot and naked. I'll howl like the jackals, mourn like ostriches. For her wound, and there when it says her wound, it's referring to Samaria and the northern tribes. For her wound is incurable and has reached even Judah. It has approached the gate of my people as far as Jerusalem. And of course, we know from biblical history that this incredible idolatry and sin began in the northern kingdom with Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, when he set up those two calves so the people would not go to Jerusalem to worship. He was in competition with Rehoboam, the king of Judah. That's where it began. And what he is saying here is it has moved from the northern kingdom, all of this sin. And by the way, there was no good king in the northern tribes. They were all evil. In the southern kingdom, there were some good kings, a few. But what he is saying is what happened in the north is coming to the south, even to the very gates of my people, that is, the gates into Jerusalem and to the temple. So he's dealing with something that's coming, and he's lamenting over this incredible situation. You remember that when Micah introduced us to his prophecy, he mentions three kings of Judah: Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now, what happened in history, if you go back to Jotham, he was a good king in Judah. He walked in the ways of his father David. But his son, that second king that is mentioned, is Ahaz, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Notice, we read from 2 Chronicles chapter 28. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the Lord's sight like his ancestor David. Now remember, Micah is prophesying during his reign, and he's seeing all of this happen. And what he is saying is, I saw what Jeroboam did and all the evil in the north coming right into Jerusalem, right into Judea. And so we read here in this passage, for he, that is Ahaz, walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. You see how that relates to what he said right here in this passage, what Micah prophesied. It began in the north, is coming all the way to Jerusalem. King Ahaz is walking in the ways of the kings of Israel and made cast images of the Baals, led Israel back into idolatry. He burned incense in the valley of Hinnom, burned his children in the fire, imitating the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites. Those of you who have been to Israel have gone right by that valley where they literally offered their children to a false god. That's how deplorable it became. And now we can understand his agonizing lament and seeing what's happened to his people right there in the city of Jerusalem. And as we think about this, I couldn't help but think of Jesus I couldn't help but think of his heart when he came, looked over Jerusalem one day. And this is what we read in the Gospel of Luke. As he, that is Jesus, approached and saw the city, he wept over it. And by the way, those are very strong words. Literally, he is weeping and weeping with agony, saying, if you knew this day what would bring peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. This is Jesus looking over Jerusalem. For the days will come on you when your enemies will build an embankment against you. And there Jesus is prophesying what the Roman hordes are going to do in AD 70. And it happened under the General Titus. They will surround you, hem you in on every side. They will crush you and your children within you to the ground. They will not leave one stone on another in you because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Sadly, that's a sort of a reenactment of what happened in Micah's day in terms of the people of Israel and how they responded to his prophecies, not only to his prophecies, but many other prophets in the Old Testament. And here's a question, and that is that how can a parent or a pastor communicate with sincere sadness and grief to someone who's living out of the will of God? Well, there are different levels of rebellion, obviously. For example, just recently I talked with a father who called me whose teenage daughter is in rebellion. But he began the conversation by simply saying, Gene, I have blown it. I haven't been listening. She's been trying to send me signals. Listen, listen, listen. And he said, I missed the signals. And he said, I'm at fault here. And then he mentioned another situation where she was a victim of someone else's sin, which also impacted her life when she was a small child. And consequently, he said, two of us bear blame, but I have not listened. He's now mistreated her. He just hasn't listened to her pain. And I thought about it all day long, and I just called him back recently, and I said, you know, one of the first things you do is need to ask forgiveness. Just ask forgiveness. Apologize. Don't ask her to apologize. You apologize. And he said, Gene, you're right. I said, begin with forgiveness. God has forgiven you. You've asked forgiveness. Ask her forgiveness. And hopefully, the Lord will use that humility to turn things around. So you have different levels of rebellion in situations. But here's one that is general to all believers who are walking out of the will of God. We find this in Galatians, and let me just simply read it. Brothers, sisters, if someone is caught in any wrongdoing, I call this biblical intervention. You who are spiritual, that is more than one of you, that's a plural pronoun. You who are spiritual should restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so you won't be tempted also. Carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So here's the principle that I think comes right out of this Old Testament passage and is verified here in the New Testament. To communicate effectively to those who are living out of the will of God, we must be able to demonstrate sincere concern regarding their sinful behavior.